There are things that can keep teachers awake at night. Conflict between students, teachers or parents, wellbeing red flags and moments of crisis. In schools, educators must respond effectively to these challenges in an ever-shifting landscape. In this series, teachers, school leaders and wellbeing practitioners take on curveball scenarios from everyday school life, and in the process, highlight positive approaches to wellbeing. I'm your host Mick Walsh, and this is Trials for Teachers. Today I'm joined by Michael Cameron. Michael is a lecturer in Adolescent Health and Wellbeing at Melbourne University and the Trauma-Informed Practice Lead at CAFS. He has also been involved in drug and alcohol counselling with YSAS. Michael is also a strong voice in advocacy for students and the critical systems that support them in schools. Hi Michael, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Are you ready?
I am. I'm prepared.
Please note that the following scenario is fictional and any similarity to events in any real school context, past or present, is purely coincidental. Jordan, a 15-year-old Year 9 student, has become increasingly isolated over the winter terms. During a group assignment in English, a classmate notices what appears to be fresh, deliberate cuts on Jordan's wrist. Overwhelmed and worried, the classmate approaches a trusted staff member during lunchtime to report what they saw. So a very significant incident and something that unfortunately can happen in schools from time to time, Michael. As always, we're going to work through an initial response, look through some follow-up actions that people in a position to support young people might take, and then some ongoing support that might be provided. So what are your initial thoughts on some of the priorities when something like this might occur?
Yeah, so I guess if I'm kind of augmenting myself as the person that the student friend has sort of came to and reached out, I guess the competing priorities there are we have a kid who potentially has a relationship with this young person who's really worried for them, but it's unclear to me, have they gained the consent to share this with me? What's this going to do to the two of those relationships if it is shared? So I kind of want to validate that student firstly, really thank them for sharing the information, let them know that they're not holding that any longer and they've passed it on to the appropriate person, because I think we have that kind of prism that says at about age 14 approximately the primary source of influence for kids shifts from parental to peer, and so kids are much more likely to take advice from their friends, to listen to their friends, and kind of on the competing priorities the word of their friends gets placed above adults, right? So kind of acknowledging that adolescence is a jungle, it's really important that that kid knows they've shared that information appropriately and it's going to be handled with care. From there, we go to the young person who's potentially isolated and self-harming. So I guess from a clinical standpoint, if I was holding this information, one of my main considerations initially goes to superficial self-harm or with the intent to die. I think that's probably something that's not as well understood in the broader spectrum, is that self-harm is a maladaptive coping strategy, but a really efficient way that young people find to emotionally regulate. I'm not stressing out immediately thinking that this student potentially is going to want to take their own life, as much as I am going to go in with some, I want to be curious, and I don't want to stress them out with my response as well. So I'd probably enter into the conversation lightly as opposed to with panic.
Yeah, I think I'd like to touch on a couple of things that you brought up there, Michael. And firstly, in working with a student, as you've said, it's a really big leap for young people to potentially loop in adults when a lot of their social decision making is determined by their peers and the other people around them. And that is a courageous move. And I suppose something that teachers can often get caught in is potentially trying to or promising to the student that they're going to hold that secret or they're going to hold that information, and sometimes being really clear, or actually often we need to be really clear on, we thank you for passing that information on and we're going to use that information to support this young person, but we can't it's not something that we can really keep to ourselves.
Yeah, I think you sort of see that a lot with particularly young people, and that whole notion of consent is that particularly with the adolescent brain, like they're only thinking usually of sort of short-term consequential thinking, and the long game is coming online through adolescence right up until 25, 30. So I think when they hear that potentially that's going to be disclosed or shared with other people, it's very hard for them to see past that initial kind of border that's put up within their own brains. In my experience and history of that, almost exclusively after the initial disclosures have happened and it's actually on the table now and it's no longer a taboo thing for that young person or the person who's self-harming to talk about, almost all of them think that it was a positive thing to have happened. It just doesn't feel like that right now. So my conversations with that student who did share would be something along those lines is I feel like we go too hard on explaining it's a legal responsibility as much as it's just a human response. Because of my duty of care and because you've disclosed this with me, now I have to do this, which I think places a kind of unfair burden on the student. You would do that regardless if it was your duty or not, which is thanks for sharing this with me, and I am going to be sharing this with other people because I'm really concerned for this student. I think it's really important to humanise that response a little bit when you kind of get too clinical with it. I think young people in particular really pick up on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. The student at that time doesn't need a robotic kind of the company line in essence. They do need that sort of human connection, and framing it as a way to support this is why the information needs to be carried on is a really positive way to do that.
Yeah,
I suppose, as you've mentioned, that when a student discloses that to a staff member, that can have some social impacts. And as you've said, it might be something that they are down the track. They're like, I'm glad this happened and I was actually able to be a supportive person. But there can be a sense of betrayal almost from maybe the student who was engaging in cutting to someone who has maybe then gone and seen a trusted adult. And maybe for the reasons if you said that, it might not be something that they themselves are worried about. That student who has sought the support of a staff member, they might need some support in how they navigate those relationships going forward.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's probably a missing middle part that I think would be really nice to do more education on in school settings and things, is how to be a good friend. I think we do it in some perspectives. But for example, in my clinical work, if I meet a young person for the first time, one of the conversations that I have off the bat is my legal responsibilities, my expectations, what they can expect of me and what I expect of them, to engage in a kind of symbiosis relationship in which I'm providing them some kind of support and they know what's going to happen with their information, when it's going to be shared, when it's not, and what their information actually is, where it's being stored and what's happening in that space. Quite interestingly, and I don't expect this of young people, but often the boundaries or the expectations of relationships are not even communicated remotely. And I think some form of exercise to get students together and, when we talk about how to check in on someone's mental health and to understand when information would be shared, I think getting front-loading as much of that information as possible so that young people kind of have loose expectations around the fact that sorry, I digress. I'll say something, because I deal with this a lot in my work. When someone knows 100% unequivocally that you will act if they share information, when they're feeling like they're harming themselves, when the disclosure happens, that is them seeking help because they expect you to respond. So rarely do I actually ever end up in the situation where I have a young person who feels betrayed because I've made that explicitly clear that if they choose me as someone to disclose this stuff to, I will share that with other people. So I think there's a space for that in peer-to-peer relationships as well, right? Is that, if we're friends and we say we're friends, and what does being a friend mean? Well, that's that we help each other out and we care for each other. Then I think we could kind of upskill or start to build young people that have expectations of their friends to look out for them. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a really great point there. And that might be something that initially after that disclosure has been made, it might be something that retroactively you need to work on students with as a way to sort of repair the relationship in that sense. As a staff member, and particularly a staff member who might not feel prepared for that disclosure, I think it's really important that they might need support with that as well.
Yeah.
Because, staff do training on how to manage disclosures, but in the busyness of a day and with other things going on, some staff might find this really confronting in that moment.
Yes.
So I think, and I'd like your thoughts on this, but enlisting help of others or consulting with staff is okay in terms of how they might follow up that conversation, or if it's a trusted adult, they know that that student might have a mentor or someone within the school who might be a good person to be in the room. But probably with a conversation that is sensitive, sometimes having an additional person in the space can be really helpful.
Yeah, certainly. I think depending on who the person is that's receiving the disclosure, their background, their understanding of how to manage those conversations, and that whole kind of adage, when in doubt, I'd always bring someone else back in. There's that kind of surf life-saving analogy that if you're a surf lifesaver, you're actually, and you see someone in a drowning situation, you're actually trained to approach them from a distance, do not establish any physical contact, and you actually approach them with your leg out in between yourself and the person who's drowning. Because what do people do when they're in a life or death situation? They try and grab onto you frantically, and then you both end up drowning. So you're actually trying to kick them back into the drowning situation if they try and grab onto you, because there's no point, you're both drowning. These kind of conversations are quite similar. You have to look after yourself and ensure that you're regulated and that you're connected before you can go out and do that for someone else. So, like different clinicians have their own sort of perspectives, but I have like some words and things that I say to myself if I'm in highly stressful situations. Like, so one of mine is, of course. I work with really complex young people and I'm in really hard situations consistently, and repeating kind of affirmation I say to myself is, of course, of course. So that way I train my brain to expect that the situation has arose because of the job that I do, and then subsequently I'm sort of able to bring myself back online and regulate before I go out and try and have a conversation.
Yeah, and look, within schools, you've got people who, in terms of school counsellors or school psychs, who are probably more familiar with this territory than others. And then you've got teachers who are just going about their day-to-day business, and it's the last thing that they would expect.
Exactly.
You've sort of highlighted that being curious and not having a overly emotive response is really important for not only the student making the disclosure, but any discussions you have with the student who's been engaging in self-harm.
Yeah.
And so in terms of students can often take their read from adults on how they need to react emotionally.
Certainly. And
presenting sort of a calm and safe environment for the discussion is pretty critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's kind of two-pronged, I think. Option one is you could create undue panic or distress. So, countertransference is a real thing. And if you come in regulated, I think you increase the probability that the young person becomes regulated. I'm not sure how much this is kind of explored in the teaching profession, but in sort of clinical work, we're very conscious of body position, where we sit in the room, where the exits are. Like, you're kind of taking into account all of the sensory information around you to ensure that whatever energy that you're sort of putting out that is being reciprocated by the young people so that they feel safe and calm. But secondarily, I think it's one of the quickest ways to lose a young person is when you come with an attitude or perspective that doesn't necessarily align with their worldview. If the young person is suicidal and they're attempting to take their own life, the last thing they need is an unregulated adult who's freaking out. But even more so, if they've found a tool that they feel is how they emotionally regulate, because this is the really complex thing that I don't think is well understood with self-harm. Often self-harm is an alternative to suicide, not a route to it. Often self-harm is a young person who's dealing with intrusive thoughts is feeling like, I'm going to take my own life here because of how invasive my thoughts are. However, if I cut myself, there's this quote, it's impossible to worry about anything else when there's blood coming out of you. So it's this really shortcut way. It's maladaptive, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of, you can have a cold shower, you can have an ice bath, you can do a bunch of other strategies, which I'm sure we'll talk about as this conversation goes on. But young people are looking for the most efficient thing at the time. And for this young person, this might have been the most efficient route they've found to potentially not act on invasive thoughts. So if we come in and tell them that they're trying to take their own life and they're sort of rejecting that premise, that will be a really quick way for them to feel misunderstood, and you'll actually create a bigger disconnect. So it's really important to come in curiously to understand, before I make any predictions or assessments on what I think they're doing or why they're doing it, I would like to give them the opportunity to tell me first.
Yeah. And that, and as you've highlighted, being curious to the conversation means that you're open to an outcome. You're not going into that discussion with the student being like, this needs to happen, then this needs to happen, and they need this. And that having that student perspective as part of it is really important also, because you want it to be led by them in a sense on what are the things that they need. How can we approach the situation in a way that fits with their understanding of the world, as you've put it, Michael?
And so here's the thing, right, is like usually when a disclosure of this magnitude is made, subsequently a bunch of things that are going to happen that are completely outside of their control. And so one of the first feelings that this young person will feel after having such sensitive information come to light is the information will be disclosed probably to multiple people without their consent. Realistically, within reason, I'm trying to involve the parents in that as well. So now their parents probably become aware. Their social circle is probably going to disclose that to other people. Depending on if they are suicidal, for example, then it's probably a mental health assessment through psychiatric triage, it's ambulance potentially. Like, their sense of control and agency in this situation is going to feel really revoked from them from the minute this starts getting addressed. So it's really important that any opportunity along that stage of things, that you can give them back power and control, that they have that. And so, for example, instead of saying, I'm really worried about your mental health and you're going home to your parents' home tonight and I don't feel safe not telling your parents, so I'm going to do that, which is still happening. It's happening regardless, right? If I form that opinion. But what I'm saying is I'm going to call your parents. Would you like to do it yourself, or would you like to be in the room with me and I'll put it on speaker? They should have privy to the conversations that are happening about them. So yeah, my radar would be incredibly attuned to ensure whatever opportunity for this young person to feel like they have choice needs to be at the forefront of my mind with whatever happens after the disclosure.
Yeah. And that they've consistently got a voice in the conversation as well.
Absolutely,
yeah. They're a part of that process.
It can't be tokenistic, right? Like, in sort of the trauma-informed literature, you present people choice. And so, like, if I was to say to you, right now, you and I are going to play a game, go. The silence is not lost on me, right? Because I gave you an infinite realm of possibilities there. You could have jumped up and down, done 10 star jumps, like, you could have chosen absolutely anything.
And I selected silence. Yeah. What does that say about me? Let's not overanalyze.
What it says is the magnitude of choice is really freezing sometimes. Too many options is debilitating. But if I said to you, would you like to do an air high five or do 5 star jumps? I'll give you a really easy choice, right? And you can just choose one of those. So similarly to with a young person, we're going to be calling your parents now. This can happen now or in 5 minutes. Or I'm going to get a drink. Would you like a water? And then we call them, or do you want to call them straight away? Like, you're creating opportunities for choice, just so even though it's an involuntary situation at that stage, you still want them to feel like they're part of it. Yeah.
That's a really interesting idea. And next time you ask me if we're going to play a game, I'm going to have something ready, okay? I promise. So when we were talking about the potentially emotive response of teachers, calling home is a completely different kettle of fish, because in terms of a parent relationship to a child, it's highly emotional, and the level of investment is really tangible. So I suppose one option is that a parent is aware, and so it's not that phone call where that you're providing them with new information. It might be something that the family has kept in-house, they've been aware of, and hasn't sort of been on the radar of schools. But the other option is it is new information for parents. And if it is not a student ringing, as you've suggested, I think it's really important that schools, as a first point, highlight that their child is okay and they're being looked after and in the care of the school. But then there's some information that we'd like to pass on to you. And I think walking really carefully into that conversation, because there is potential for parents to become really distressed. Oh,
for sure. And not to get too somber with it too, but you also have to have considerations about what is the home environment like. There's the potential for family violence and things. So you want to be making an assessment that you're disclosing this information to safe hands as well. I think a general rule that is pretty reasonable is that we should spend the most time and resources on the people who spend the most time with the young person. And so I think early on in my career, I was a little bit it's quite boisterous. Like, I was a drug and alcohol clinician when I first started, and this is a very taboo subject, is if you have a young person who's using substances and potentially wants that kept from their parents. And I probably augmented myself too much on the side of the young person, not realizing that I can have them in session talking trash about their parents every hour for a year while they see me as their counsellor, but then they go back into that environment that I've just fully validated is potentially harmful or problematic. And so I learned it early on, and I've gotten a lot better at it now, is there's times and situations where you wouldn't involve the parents, but I'm very scarce with when I select those moments, and I have to have a really strong rationale. And then becoming a parent myself now, the thought of potentially my child dealing with a wellbeing issue and it not being disclosed to me nearly gives me a heart attack, right? So I think I've done a lot of growing in that space as well. But you want to... It's a trap you can fall into too, depending on if you're the wellbeing person or you're just a kind of normative teacher. I hear this stuff consistently nearly every single day. It may be the first time a parent's hearing it. You don't want to come across like this is a business as usual conversation as well. You've really got to validate them, because it's hard enough for people who have studied the thing for years to understand potentially the difference between superficial self-harm and suicidal ideation or a real attempt to take their own life. Can we expect a painter who has no mental health background to understand that delineation in the same way that I do? Probably not.
Yeah, and there's a diverse range of possible responses. Yeah. Based on some of those factors you've suggested. And so within schools, one role is that you might be educating parents on what does this mean. And as you've said, cutting can be a way for young people to feel grounded, to alleviate some of their intrapersonal stress. There's all sorts of reasons why that might happen. But parents can jump to conclusions.
Yes.
And it's possible that some parents will feel a strong sense of shame that their young person it's been disclosed that the young person is engaging in this, and why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? So you might feel that by speaking to a parent, you could potentially put a young person in a more difficult situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you raise, because I think the shame, guilt, and stigma when you potentially have a child that's struggling with an issue is a real thing. And particularly, I do a lot of work in residential care, and these are spaces for people who don't know, it's where, for whatever reason, young people can't live with their parents or family members, and so they come into a facility. I didn't know these spaces existed whilst I was in school. And then I stumbled into this field out of an incomplete law degree, actually. But I was 18 years old, driving 4 17-year-old young people around in a residential care unit, calling myself their carer. I couldn't even cook for myself at the time, but I happened to be in this job. And the moment is not lost on me when I drove these kids to school one day, and it was in a work van, and I was probably the 4th different worker to drop them off that week, where everyone else is either on the bus or has the same parents dropping them off. And I just had this wave of realization hit me that there's kids that are going through things that you wouldn't even be remotely possible to fathom, how dark some of this stuff is. And so a big issue that a lot of the young people I work with face is that when you go to the local sporting club and all the parents sit around and have discussions about their kids and what's going on, like, this is not an opportunity for kids in residential care. In the same breath, it's great to talk about your kid when they're high achieving, they're performing well. Is it the same conversation for these parents when they go to the local sporting club and their kid's really struggling, particularly if it's public with social media and things at the moment? It's like, I think it can get really ostracizing for parents really quickly. And, the rumor mill travels fast, and I'm sure that still in a lot of spaces that are potentially less learned on the subject, it would be seen as a failure of parenting in some capacity. So that would be a big part of my consideration as well, is ensuring that validating enough for the parents so that they feel like it's a situation that can happen to anyone, because mental health doesn't discriminate, but also not making them feel powerless in the situation, because there's actually a bunch of power and control and things that they can do to potentially assist as well.
So as a part of that, the follow-up actions you would take, and when you are speaking to parents, my thoughts would be that the parents need particularly if it's unfamiliar territory for them, that they do need a sense of a tangible plan and what's next. What are the next steps that I can sort of do? Particularly if it's something that they're going to be struggling with on an emotional level as well. So as far as those steps, highlighting what they can do at their end, what we're going to be doing at our end at school is really important. And making sure that the student is safe within the school environment, because it's possible that the coping mechanisms the student is applying might relate to some of the experiences or triggers that they have at school.
Yes, absolutely. I think that would be my first point of call before going into the actions and things, would be a really comprehensive conversation with that student about what's going on. Because I reflect back to my year 7 and 8 days with the, I'm not sure if they even still have them now, but the protractors that you put the pencil on, and we used to scratch up our arms and things with those. It's like, that was playful adolescence. So like, I don't want to jump to any conclusions about what's going on here. I would really like to have a conversation with the student first. From there, there's a lot of different sort of branches that conversation could take and my responses would take, but let's kind of assume that it's reasonably serious. The self-harm is, because, death by misadventure is a real thing too. So even if a young person is doing it to regulate themselves, this is a bit of a precarious topic, and my advice is only do this if you're a trained clinician. But it's important to know how to do it safely if they are doing it, regardless if anyone is saying so or not. You can't expect the problem to vanish overnight. I think a lot of the time we think, now that it's out in the open, that we create an expectation that this kid's never going to do it again. And the reality is that it can be an addictive behaviour. It can be really positive for regulating emotions, at least in the short term, for the young person. So to ask them, you shouldn't take something away unless you replace it with something of equal or greater value. And so to ask them to remove what might be considered their primary coping strategy without giving them a bunch of other strategies will increase the probability that they do something that potentially is more lethal.
So you mentioned that before, and you mentioned a couple of perhaps suggestions in terms of like ice baths and things like that. What is the process like for engaging a student in some replacements?
Yeah.
And what are the factors that make it more likely for them to take it up?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing, and this is really good tips for anyone who's watching someone that's dealing with an addictive behaviour. This is very counterintuitive, but I've done this work for a long time. I really mean this. Is one of the most dangerous things that you can do for someone who's potentially an addict to anything is overpraise a period of sobriety. So what this means is, for this example, self-harm, but it could be anything. Like it could be cannabis or alcohol or whatever is the kind of person's vice. What the young people hear too often is, Michael, you're so much more clear-headed now. I can talk to you and actually have a conversation. It's like the old Michael's back. You look so much healthier. It's really good to see you. And what you actually do is you create a narrative for that young person that you're only worthy of praise when you're not doing this behaviour. And all of the compliments and praise I've given you for not doing it, I actually thought the exact opposite about you when you were doing it. The reality is that most people who do delve into these behaviours will do it again at some stage. It's like upwards of 90% of people who have an issue will replicate it at some stage. So now we basically know 100% that they're going to do it again, but now they feel shame, guilt, stigma, isolation, and we've actually decreased the probability that they'll come and talk to the important people in their life about it. So the antidote to this is you praise the effort, not the outcome, because they'll always have the effort. They may not always have the outcome. So it must have been really hard for 2 weeks for you not to self-harm. I can imagine how stressed you must have felt during that time, but you chose not to anyway. That's really impressive. This is really important because what you want to do, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. And so stating the problem back to a young person is really important. So for them to hear it reciprocated by an adult that must have been really hard, but you had it in you. You had the skills not to do it. You chose to do an alternative method instead of self-harming. These are all really important affirmations that young people need to hear from other adults so that they can state the problem better in their head, that they can feel capable and I am worthy. So that's the kind of ethos part of it. And then into the practical strategies, I essentially just go through a laundry list of alternative options. And I think what happens too often is we kind of actually spoon feed safety plans to young people, but it's not their safety plan, it's our safety plan. I fundamentally reject that premise. If a young person does not want to participate in a safety plan with me, there is no point having the safety plan. What we'll mostly do in the field is we'll write a safety plan that has the illusion that they've participated, and it's got a bunch of strategies that they are not going to use, and it's not worth the paper it's wrote on. So if I say I'll give 100 suggestions to a young person and just the possibility that they might even pick up one. So holding ice blocks, cold showers, rubber bands around the wrist so they can sort of pull it back and feel a light sensation of pain. These are all kind of practical strategies. So I actually did my master's thesis on interviewing young people about how they derive meaning from music. The title of my thesis was When Words Fail, Music Speaks. And I think this is particularly true for adolescents. And everyone's favourite band was usually something they listened to during high school. And it doesn't leave you. It's that integral into your brain and your biology. And it's like it speaks to you. Music speaks to you differently as a kid. And so part of my safety planning with young people is like, I don't just have in the safety plan, listen to music, which you'll see in a lot of them. I want to know what artists they listen to, down to what moods, down to what songs specifically, down to why they like those songs. Because then all of a sudden, if I'm noticing that Jordan is dysregulated in class, I might know a song that can bring him back online, that can regulate him. But I only get there through asking him and having like proper conversations about. And another thing, this is just a bit of a side note, but one of the safest things you can do as a parent is get to know your kids' friends, because they'll be the ones who contact you when something's going wrong. If you don't approve of the friendship group and you tell your child that, they will go and do it anyway, and these kids just won't call you. Now, I understand that's hard to hear because sometimes your kid just makes friends with people that you don't necessarily want to be around. But in the same breath, what I would be doing as a parent in this situation is I would be like putting extra emphasis on making sure that I felt connected to the people that my child was connected to. Because ultimately, if I'm worried for my child's well-being, and I can only assume that their friends are as well, then I'm increasing the probability that my child remains safe if I do that. So I think a lot of the time you'll be, ever since he started hanging around with Michael, he started self-harming. He needs to stop seeing that Michael, and I think that's a really harmful response too, even though I understand it.
Yeah, and look, a lot of the conversations at schools is around their, who they are and their influences and their group of friends. But I think that's something I haven't considered, that idea that that building relational support with others within that, that's the sphere of that young person is really important.
Yeah, certainly. And it's sort of, I don't like the term peer pressure as well. I think the way to reframe it is need for connection. The kid wasn't peer pressured into anything. They had a stronger need for connection than the alternative. Because then if you frame it that way, you start to understand that the kids aren't wanting to fit in because they're morally weak and that they succumbed to the pressure put on them by the student. They wanted to fit in because their friends are really important, and it's a necessity in adolescence to have friends, and we're pack creatures, Yeah.
And particularly at that sort of, year 7, 8 and 9, that the need, it is a higher need in terms of their values, in terms of what they need is those relational kind of connections with others. And it is, as much as we wouldn't like it to be, we like to think that they're interested in maths and English and all these other things. And what we have to say as teachers, it's a clear priority for them.
And that's probably one of the biggest misunderstood topics for me and working with adolescents is identity formation. If I'm not Michael the academic or Michael the sports player, I could be Michael the self-harmer. Immediately, when people see my social media profiles or they even just view my arms, they can establish with me an identity or a framework that I can attach my personality to. And the nail that sticks out gets hammered in school. And so it's really important to have a group to be a part of. And what usually happens is, like, establishing an identity is such an exploration for young people that they try on so many different hats. And there's a real culture online, particularly with self-harming and things, that if you post a photo of your arm that has some marks on it, multiple people will reach out to you and ask you if you're okay. it gets framed incorrectly a lot of the time as a need, as like the person wanting attention, when it actually is. But what the question you should ask is, if they're willing to go to that length for attention, that probably suggests that we should give them some more attention. It's not a negative thing to want to be seen or want to be heard. And if you don't feel checked in on and you don't feel that people care that much about you, and then you start doing this thing, and then all of a sudden people are really, really worried, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's a really important thing too, is like you want to separate your responsive care from the behavior as well. It has to be, I care about you and I would be doing all of these things separate to the fact that you're harming yourself, not because you're harming yourself. Because you don't want to create a reality for that young person in which they feel like they need to keep doing that to elicit care responses from trusted people in their lives.
Yeah, great point. And something I wanted to focus on there is you were talking about the young person needing that attention, and what might be a kind of a normal social response when something like this occurs, or if it becomes known that someone has been engaging in self-harm, is that people may distance themselves. And I'm not just talking about peers, I'm talking about teachers. And an adult response to this might be, that kid is going through some stuff, I'm going to give them a wide berth, I'm going to give them space. And if we assume best intentions, then that might be okay. But it might be doing further damage in terms of isolating that person from within their environment also.
Beautifully said. I don't think I could add much more to that beyond the fact that the solution almost always is more connection, not less. Now, it's easy to feel invasive or to feel like, particularly when you have a young, like I like the notion of occupying the space and allowing to sit in silence. So, I do this with my daughter at home. It's like she can go away and regulate herself if she needs. But children, particularly young children, are so immediacy based that she might be calm after 2 minutes of entering into her room and having a little cry. But she might not know that we're ready to reestablish that relationship unless I'm in eyesight of her. And so I don't like leaving her alone for too long while she's going through that process, because it's really important that she sees, regardless of her emotional presentation, I'm still going to be here. And I think this is the same for young people. You respect their space if they ask for it and treat them like the expert in their own lives within reason. But, we have this saying when you work in the residential care houses, which is always be pottering. So if you're not directly interacting, you're in the kitchen just wiping up some things, or you're within the orbit, and then occasionally the young people kind of extend the olive branch with some form of light conversation, and then you just look for your opportunities to enter in and have a conversation. But you don't get those opportunities if you're not around them. So as much as reasonably practicable and that isn't super offensive and cramping their style, or just be accessible and be in the space in some way.
Yeah, and look, we talked about that prior to pressing record, this idea that sometimes the capacity of schools are limited when the proper wraparound support is required for an individual student.
Yeah.
But that might be something really practical that teachers can focus on, is, when they do have a moment, or if they do have a task that involves being in the orbit of the people within their environment, whether that's staff, whether it's peers, that can be really a good way to kind of be available and accessible to a conversation.
Yeah, exactly right. You don't have to have the ongoing deep and meaningful conversation to feel like you've done something. Sometimes just, the power of presence is a real thing.
Yeah. I'd like to sort of one final question on this, and sure. I've learnt so much during this conversation with how schools can respond in terms of ongoing support for a student, and mainly focused on the student who is involved in the self-harm. What would be your advice to schools in how they, from a ongoing support perspective, how they might work with this student and the family?
Yeah. Firstly, the important part is that really acknowledging that this is hard work and that you're allowed to respond poorly for a while. What I mean by that is inaction is often more dangerous than action. And so acting and doing something is usually the right course of action, as opposed to being a bit trepidatious because it fills you with anxiety or fear. So being seen as people who act, I think, is really important and really stabilizing for adolescents. But beyond that, I would be reaching out to people who are more qualified to make the assessments and opinions. So I certainly don't want workers making assessments on whether they think the self-harm is superficial or not without consulting with someone who's got a clinical background. The last thing that you would want to do is have a young person freak out, tell you they weren't trying to harm themselves, even though they actually were, and you taking that at face value and then not sort of acting. So I think take every presentation seriously, consult with as many professionals as you can. And then beyond that, I think, I come back to this notion of connection consistently, but I think this is really important. Like I think you said in the sort of preamble about Jordan too, that he'd become isolated over a period of time. So I'm looking for any possible pro-social activities that he can be involved in that have a sort of ease of access to them. And with some of the work the school can be doing, I think a lot of people sort of feel like you have to be talking about it with him every single day and be checking in on his mental health every single day. You want to do a form of that, but you don't want him to feel like he's a subject either. So often some of the best work that you can do is just creating normative environments for him in which he feels connected, in which he has opportunities to socialize with other people, so that he doesn't feel like the black sheep in that situation. Because, I think Johann Hari said this, the opposite to addiction is connection, and I really believe that. So,
what a way to finish. That was perfect. I'd like to just take us through, Michael, some of our key takeaways here, and if I've missed anything, please jump in. The idea that stuck out to me in terms of how we respond initially was a word that you used, which was we need to humanise the interactions. We don't want to come across as a kind of like a scripted robotic response to something, and there's a human consideration there, and there are a number of reasons why someone might engage in this sort of behaviour that might not be dire, and it might be just a coping mechanism. So we need to walk in curiously, I think, is something that you've mentioned there.
Absolutely.
So we need to also create a safe environment for those conversations, and we need to make sure that the staff are equipped to do that. And one thing you've mentioned at the end there is that when we need to outsource those discussions and always consult clinically when making school-based decisions around this person's wellbeing.
Yep.
When we got to follow-up actions, another thing that you mentioned was that we need to, as we're working with this young person, acknowledge effort, not outcome, and that maybe their perceptions around who they are can be really caught up in the way that we respond, or we praise or overpraise them when they are considered or engaging what we would consider normally.
Yes.
So there's a danger in that. We don't want that student to be further isolated.
Yes.
We also spoke about that that in that school environment, sometimes we might consider them a person, or there might be a perception of them as maybe, someone who's damaged goods in essence, and that a common response is to actually distance ourselves when that person might be striving for connection and support. And clearly that last advice that you've given was really critical in terms of schools don't have to be the experts in the space, but we need to create that safe environment by working externally potentially, and we need to, your last thought there was really student-centered.
Yeah.
And keeping them, and it takes us back to that idea of humanising everything, really. It's about that individual and what we can do for them.
Yeah,
Was there anything I missed there? Probably was.
No, you nailed it, I think. I think one thing we probably didn't touch on, though, but it's kind of the prism that I filter all of this through, is like attachment styles. And I think, not to give a layman's overview of attachment styles, but essentially, in the first 4 years of life, how much you express distress and then how much your primary caregivers come to you and provide comfort establishes the entire way in which you interact with everyone and how you establish relationships. So when you really strip back human emotion or human psychology, it's distress and comfort. So if you have a young person who's expressing distress, you should provide them comfort. And when things get too complicated, I always just go back to that.
I think that's great advice. As always, we like to finish with a wellbeing wind down. And I'm going to throw a curveball at you.
Sure.
I know we've discussed some ideas, but I love your idea about the band or music that you listened to when you were young. And I definitely know for me, every now and then, you kind of venture back into that back catalogue and
Yeah.
find something. So I'm going to ask you, what is a band or even a specific song that for you kind of embodies that time of youth, or something that kind of makes you feel comfortable?
That's a brilliant question. There's so many. So for me, actually, there's a rapper who goes by the name of 360. He was really quite big in my adolescence, and was all of the worst things that people say about rappers, but also all of the really positive things as well. But he had this song, Hope You Don't Mind, which is a very, it's quite emotional, and it's quite dark. It's about his own mental health and things like that. But it, as a kind of angsty teen dealing with all of these emotions and having no idea to process them, like I kind of really resonated with him and with that song particularly. So I always sort of creep back into that space from time to time when I'm emotionally available to dip my toe back into that period. And yeah, it's equal parts validating as also a reminder of how far I've come too. So I think that's music can take you, it's like a time machine, right? It can take you back to times and places and people you're around. And yeah, so if anyone wants to listen to 360, let's bring him back. And
maybe I'll finish this episode with a little outro if the copyright clears. I'm going to go with, for me, and probably piggybacking on what you've just said there, Michael, Jeff Buckley's Grace album. I don't know if you're familiar. And I probably missed the boat a little bit because I got into him as a teenager, but I missed his one Melbourne show that he did, unfortunately.
Brutal.
But it is a tortured sort of masterpiece, I think. And, Jeff was going through a lot, battling a lot of mental demons, but it's such beautiful songwriting.
Yeah.
And, it's not something that you would chuck on just sort of heading down the shops. You've got to be really set for that. You've got to kind of get the cans on and experience it. So
100%.
But music is really powerful.
Definitely.
Thank you. So you can contact us through our socials and have your say. And to all the people who hold the line in our schools, while you are all busy taking care of others, make sure to spare some time for yourself. Until next time, this has been Trials for Teachers.